Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who prefer to experience their martyrdom hungover as hell. Each month we spin the wheel and land on a new genre, and right now it is historical fiction.
Oh, that pun, Zach. Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. We're reading that. Power and the Glory by Greene. A Rising Man by Abir Mukherjee, and Baudolino by Umberto Eco.
And this time it is The Power and the Glory by Greene. I'm Zach, and this week I am really interested in thinking about who this book is sympathetic towards, if anyone.
If anyone. I'm Bob, and I'm interested in, when we read Kazuo Ishiguro, when we read Remains of the Day, it was for historical fiction, and I didn't talk about historical fiction at all. Thankfully, Zach did. So this week, I'm really interested. I'm interested in historical fiction. What is the history of this book? And then do tropes of historical fiction, or tropes that we think of as historical, get in the way of making something historically accurate or authentic?
Ooh, that is really interesting. First off, I guess I should ask, what do you know about this book?
Okay, so for why Greene wrote it, and we can talk about the history too, but Greene went to Mexico, I think in 1938, and he was working with his editor to get a trip over there since 1936. They wanted him to go over there and look at religious prosecution because this happens in the Cristero War, which lasted about 3 years from 1926 to 1929. And so by the time he gets over there, most of the religious persecution is kind of done. But he gets there, 1938, he comes out with a book called The Lawless Roads. Yeah, Lawless Roads. And then in 1939, that comes out, and he starts writing The Power and the Glory, which comes out in 1940. So Power and the Glory is, he was there for quite a long time. But it's almost not historical fiction because it's only happening maybe 6 or 7 years later, maybe 10. So it's almost fake historical fiction, because it's more like journalism.
And that's really what is so interesting about this book to me from a historical fiction lens, because a lot of the definitions of historical fiction that I have been reading online, people say it should generally be about 50 years in the past. Now, why they settle on this seemingly arbitrary round number, I have no idea. But I agree with you that if it is too recent, it does start to feel a little bit like journalism. However, I think the fact that he wrote a nonfiction book and published it directly before this might, in some sense, I don't know, just guessing, it might in some sense free up his creative faculties to allow himself to add to lean in on the fiction rather than on the documentary, journalistic, historian side of his brain.
I think that's true. So this is part of what would be called the Catholic series, and I think it's the second book coming after one we haven't read yet, and then the last one I think is The End of the Affair, which we have read. But before this period, and I guess the trip to Mexico helped as well, he was not really willing to talk about his Catholicism, and he wasn't planning on ever writing about it. So going there, I guess, woke up this desire to do so. And so, yes, he could have just said, okay, my contract was to only write the Lawless Roads, and then after that, I'm not going to write any more about Mexico. But he was so affected by his trip there that he wrote Power and the Glory, and I think it is a consideration of Catholicism. We read Shusaku Endo's Silence before, and he was inspired by Greene, and the books are very parallel. There's even kind of the same set of characters in both books. But I think that Greene and Shusaku Endo are really interested in what is a true, not necessarily martyr, but a true follower of the faith, a true Catholic. So I think he is really not just devoted to the history, but devoted to the characters and the story.
Yeah, I think that Endo's book, Silence, is such a great comparison point for this. I didn't realize at the time that it was so heavily influenced by this book, but reading this book, I was like, oh, we are really, really doing the same thing. But part of what really strikes me is that it seems like of all of the heavily Christian literature that we've read, it's rarely resolutely Christian, if that makes sense. Doubt seems to be seeping into all of the, at least modern Christian fiction that we've read. It's always the most Christian books where the protagonists are the least stable, the most shaky in their faith.
I want to compare the two books really quick. And then when we read Silence, we were all at a disagreement. We're like, I don't know. Is Father Rodriguez, is he a good Catholic or is he a fake Catholic? And you, me, John, and Josh kind of disagreed about it. And I think it's more clear in this book what the message is. In Endo, it kind of leaves you confused a little bit. You don't know really if Father Rodriguez has done the right thing or the wrong thing. But take a look at these characters. I mean, the whiskey priest here is like the Father Rodriguez character. We have to watch him and decide, okay, is he a real Catholic or not? Then we have the Mestizo character, the character who is called the Judas all the time. He's just like Kichijiro from Endo. And then the lieutenant is just like the interpreter or the inquisitor. So the books are quite similar. 26 years later, Silence comes out. But what do you think of the whiskey priest? When we read Father Rodriguez, we said, okay, he's trying his best. He's really suffering a lot. But when it comes to stepping on the fumi, he steps on it because is he afraid of getting tortured himself? Or is he trying to save the other Christians who are going to be tortured? In this, it's clear that the whiskey priest is not a very good priest. He's an alcoholic. He's got a kid that he kind of just abandoned. He shouldn't be having kids as a priest anyway. And he's doubting all the time, doing the wrong thing all the time. But he is just trying to get back to his old parish. He's trying to go and confess to someone so he can be a good Catholic.
There's a lot of work being done to kind of make out this priest as being essentially fallen, I guess you could say, essentially not a very good, or even maybe not even a true priest, not even a very true Christian. But I think that a lot of the territory that Graham Greene wants to explore is the idea of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And I think that wasn't actually clear to me until the very end. Because if you look at this character from a letter of the law thing, well, he doesn't fast anymore. He doesn't eat fish on Fridays. He drinks a lot of brandy. He has a child who he has seemingly abandoned. All of these things don't make you a priest anymore. And yet, he constantly, how can I say this, does the right thing. He makes the correct Christian choice in matters of life and death. First off, he gets left behind by his boat in dangerous terrain because he heard that someone needed a doctor. And the closing of the trap around him was when this Judas character says, hey, the gunslinger, the outlaw from the United States was shot and is asking for a priest. And he says, well, if I go to this person, I'll clearly be in the state where I would be arrested for being a Catholic priest, arrested and killed. And clearly you are setting this trap because there is a 600 peso bounty on my head. And the guy's like, yeah, more or less. And he's like, well, I have to go regardless. So he's making the right choices every single time that a good Christian would make.
Does that feel to you different from Father Rodriguez, who is also making the right choices that a good Christian would make? It's funny that the whiskey priest here, he gets to almost a paradise, before he moves on and gets into the sticky situation of having to go say the last rites to the dying American, because he's in a little town and they've needed a priest for the last 3 years. And they say, oh, just live here. We're very happy to have you. He does almost like 100 baptisms in the few days that he's there, hundreds of confessions. And he says that he tells us at least, he has to leave because he has to go and confess himself or he is not following Catholicism and he's done a bad job. What do you think of that compared with Rodriguez, who at the very end, he and the other proselytized priest are investigating people's their luggage to see if they have any Catholic items, and if they do, they turn them in. So they are now they're persecuting other people themselves, whereas before they were being followed, they were being stalked, and they were trying to keep the faith alive. Now they have become police, trying to shut the faith down. What do you think of the heroism of the whiskey priest versus what seemed like heroism for the priests in Silence?
That's a really good question. And yeah, I think that this is the largest point in which Endo's book, Silence, charts its own territory from this book, in that in that what he's talking about there is the different domain that period of Japan was, and the complexity of what these people do when they choose to survive rather than die for their faith, rather than become martyred in that era of Japan. I will say that here, I wasn't entirely convinced that when he got to across the border that we'd entered into some kind of paradise. On the contrary, I actually felt like it added weight, I guess, and truth to everything that the lieutenant was saying about the Catholic Church. When they get over there, they're living basically lives of luxury. And they're in a situation where they are just raking in massive amounts of money from these peasants there. He spends the whole book basically just being like, I only have 10 pesos and and I'm begging for food. I can't afford new clothes, all these things. And then he gets over to this other place and there are people who are in very bad conditions. But he says, yeah, if you want me to baptize your children, that's going to be like 2 pesos a head. So he immediately upon getting there, he starts calculating and speculating like, oh, well, I have this number of babies and at this price per head, I can afford to buy a mule, new shoes, and a bunch of bottles of alcohol. And in a sense, in that moment, it's really to me, I felt like it was a condemnation of the church in that particular region, and also a vindication of everything that the lieutenants were up to. What did you think of this scene near the end?
Well, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you about, too, because we were curious about this reading Silence. The Inquisitor is the nice old man. He's very patient. And then later you find out he's the torturer. Here, the lieutenant is great. He looks good. He's kind. He even gives the priest, when he doesn't know who he is, some money and tells him just, get out of jail, go and buy yourself some food. He seems pretty great. When they have their long conversation, he says to the priest, I am doing this to root out all religion from Mexico. And we were saying earlier that maybe Graham Greene is not necessarily writing historical fiction, but this because it's more journalism. But for us, it's historical and it is steeped in history. I want to read a couple of things from history, read you a quote from the lieutenant, and then see what you think about him too, because he might have a point. The history, the Constitution of 1917 comes after the Mexican Revolution, and this is about the time when all of this is happening. And that included a lot about taking all religion out. They wanted everything to be democratic, somewhat socialist, and have no religious influence. And that comes after a dictator who was close with the Catholic Church and giving the Catholic Church a lot of land. And so after this revolution, everyone's trying to keep religion out. However, only Tabasco really took it seriously, and everywhere else you just didn't talk about it. And if people were practicing religion, maybe you would get in trouble, maybe you wouldn't. In Tabasco, there were people like the lieutenant hunting people down. Now, he eventually confronts the whiskey priest, and he says, look, I am doing this because I believe in our people, and I don't believe in your fake religion, he says. So he says, you're fools if you still believe what the priests tell you. All they want is your money. What has God ever done for you? Have you gotten enough to eat? Have your children got enough to eat? Instead of food, they talk to you about heaven. Oh, everything will be fine after you are dead, they say. I tell you, everything will be fine when they are dead, and you must help. Pretty violent, but he wants to do the right thing in his mind.
He does, and his character is interesting because it's not all just high ideals. It's not all just a kind of philosophic hatred of the church. He also seems to have been raised a Catholic and have had some sort of negative experience there while he was young. It doesn't really go into any clear detail about what, the nature of that is, but he seems to also have a personal vendetta against it. And I think that is what makes his character so rich, is that you can have someone who, isn't a villain, who definitely is a person who views the ends as being able to justify the means, but he's not evil for evil's sake. He's not cruel. He's not malicious. He's a person who appears to have been deeply hurt in his past and has now intellectualized that as a kind of a vision of atheism for the future. And the means that he now pursues that put him directly in conflict with our protagonist. And that right there is an excellent antagonist, if you ask me.
I love it too when the antagonist and the protagonist, if we can call either of them our antagonist or protagonist, when they have the almost exact turn of phrase for something and it defines who they are and what they believe in. Because at one point, the lieutenant comes in and is investigating the village where the whiskey priest has his daughter, and he's undercover. He doesn't know who the priest is, so he gets away with it this time. But he sees the daughter, and he says, "This child here is worth more than all of anyone believing, any of the Catholics, any member of the church." And then later, the priest says the same thing about the same person. He says, "You're worth more than anyone else here because basically, she's been baptized and she has the memories and all of the devotion to Catholicism. So she is connected to God in his mind, whereas the other people are not." It's funny how they are saying the exact same thing, but it means completely different things.
And I guess maybe this is a good time for me to head back to my initial thought opening up this video, which was, who do you think Graham Greene is sympathetic towards in this book? Because, we've already talked about the priest and the lieutenant, but I guess, spiraling outward, the local people, the kind of expats who are either living there or stuck there or, affiliated with the church there. Is there anyone in this book that you feel like Graham Greene really endorses their place, position, or worldview?
I think Graham Greene is a Catholic, and I think the whiskey priest is extremely sympathetic. He is doing bad things here and there, but he is a hero, and he's doing really amazing things. And I feel attached to him throughout the whole book. And when he makes the decision, I know I'm going to go get killed. I know this is a trap. I'm going to go and say his last rites. He does things like that maybe a dozen times in this book, and he's been doing it his whole life. Even though he tells us, I'm a bad guy, I don't deserve to be a priest, I don't deserve to be a Catholic, he's still doing his duty. And I feel like the message might, one of the messages could be, the calling could happen to anyone. And even if you have a lot of these little problems, and even if you make a lot of mistakes, it takes... I guess anyone can be God's messenger in this. Even though he seems and doesn't believe in himself, he seems like a failure. He's still doing what he should as a priest, murkily, but he still does it.
Murkily, but the total, the sum effect of everything he does seems in some way to be, I don't want to say called into question, but how do you reconcile that last final scene, which I really, really loved, by the way, where they first get the dentist looking out the window to see him dragged out to the street and shot. And it's very unceremonious. And, he raises his hand to say up something and it sounds like excuse, but then bam, and he's, killed right there. And then he's described as lying in a clump. Just a pile of human on the street that is just going to be taken out with the trash. It's really, I don't want to say mundane, but it's very material. It's not idealized at all. But then we're immediately given a contrasting experience by a mother reading children from a book about the martyrdom of saints. And you couldn't have a different picture. It's very stylized. It's very glorious. So what kind of message do you think Graham Greene is trying to give us here with this stark contrast that he gives us?
I think at the end, when we see the little boy the story's being read to him and his two sisters, and he is not interested in anything but the violence. He's like, well, how did the murderer die? Tell me. But when at one point, he sees the lieutenant, and the lieutenant shows him his gun, and the lieutenant thinks, okay, I've converted this kid, or this kid is going to be devoted to the cause. Later at the end, when he's already identified with the priest, he's met the priest, and then he knows that the priest has just been killed. He sees the lieutenant again, spits out the window, and the spit hits the lieutenant's gun. Later, when a man comes up to the door, he just tells him, I'm a priest, and the boy says, come on in. So where the little boy might have been on the fence at one point, am I going to follow the lieutenant? Am I going to follow the priest in Catholicism? He seems to have made a very clear decision by the end. The mother's reading that story really, really quick because she could get in trouble. I think, at least to me, that message is clear at the end. In a different scene, though, I lost some faith in him. I felt, and it happened for me too throughout Silence, where it feels like, okay, if the priests just confessed what they were doing, all of these innocent people wouldn't have to be tortured. The priests, of course, and the whiskey priest in this has an argument against that. But just to give you an example, earlier again, when the lieutenant comes to that little village where his daughter is, he's going to take a hostage. And now he's already killed a few hostages at this point, and of course he blames it on the priest. But the priest he doesn't say who he is. Instead, he says, take me, I'm an old farmer, I can't work that well anymore. Take me as a hostage instead. And the lieutenant, of course, says, why would we want someone like you? You can't even work, so it doesn't work. Later, he says, I did my best. It's your job to give me up. What do you expect me to do? It's not my job to be caught. I felt like, not very proud of that. How did you feel about this?
Yeah. I mean, I guess fundamentally he's kind of right. It is their job to give him up and his job to run away, but it does put him in a weird position, and it's not entirely clear to me why people in that town wouldn't have just given him up. I guess what it does do is actually show how sympathetic the people are to him, in the sense that no one is willing to give him up. I suppose the idea of, for someone who is, a Christian, the idea of betraying a priest would probably weigh pretty heavy on your, on your tally of sins that, the angel reads to you on the gates of heaven. So in that regard, it actually does a lot to characterize exactly just how much the other people's view of this character dictates the way that they interact with him. He's a priest, so he must be of some great value and importance, and to betray him would be absolutely horrible and terrible. But we as readers know, because we have a privileged view into the character and into the way his mind works, that he's less than his station, I think is what I want to say. He's a bit less than the reputation of his station.
Is the reputation of his station. I would love any Catholics' opinions on this. I think this is a very interesting part of the book, and it just has me very curious, because it had me curious in Silence too. So I'd love any Catholic perspective. But I know it's a mortal sin if they give him up. If they say this is a priest, they are kind of casting off their ties to Christianity, to Catholicism at that point, and they're giving up. And if you do that, you're risking your own soul. Your soul might be damned at that point. So it's a balance. It just is very interesting to have, everyone is turned into a martyr here. If you give up the priest, you will be saved, but maybe your soul will be not saved at all. But there's just so much death and destruction. Of course, it's not the priest's fault. It's the 1917 Constitution and the Articles. But of course, he's breaking the law. But then you look at the other character. What is his name? Padre? Is it not Padre Jose? Or it is Padre Jose. Father Jose. He is the example of accepting the law. He was a priest, Padre, accepting the law, getting married, and then just not following Catholicism anymore. And he's a laughingstock. The kids run around singing his name. He's not allowed to leave his room. He lives a miserable existence, and it seems not heroic at all, whereas even the whiskey priest, in all of his failings, seems very heroic.
Yeah, he won't leave the house to go hear the deathbed confessions of the priest, which is such a... I mean, there's a kind of risk in doing that, obviously, because if you do that, then you're identifying yourself as back working as a priest, and thus, it's a risk to, at that point, become shot or whatever, become executed along with the whiskey priest. So there is a sense that he functions as a true foil, a person who has truly renounced the church, and in doing so is really living in his own personal hell, hell on earth, hell in life, or at least the closest that I would consider to be what hell in life would look like. So yeah, he was There's quite a few characters who Graham Greene is clearly not sympathetic to. There's questions in my mind still about if he's truly 100% sympathetic towards anyone, but this character in particular, I am very certain that he is unsympathetic towards. And the same goes to the Judas character, the mestizo.
Yes, the Judas character in this seems to be a negative character, whereas in Endo, he is almost redeemed, Kichijiro. As loathsome as he is, he's almost redeemed because he's still coming back, trying to confess again and again and again. I want to look a little bit at more of the history of this, Zach. I just got to thinking about how much, when we read this, how much are we really affecting history? Because, just for example, if I'm reading like the history of very old Britain and we have chainmail referenced, I'm immediately just picturing Sandor Clegane. And I'm sure that is not what is intended by the author, and is not historically authentic for the author's intention. What do you think? Is there anything in here that feels like maybe a cliche or just a trope that has gone too far because of our connection to it? It maybe is not a trope for Graham Greene, but it's something that we read and we are then far removed from what is actually the historical picture.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was thinking of the good and the bad and the ugly constantly as I was reading this book. That kind of dynamic between Lieutenant, the bad, the priest, the good, and the Judas character, who is clearly the ugly. That whole dynamic and the kind of motivations and the ways they interacted with the world completely reminded me of just, the kind of heightened dramatic portrayals of a spaghetti Western. But I wouldn't say that's Graham Greene's fault. And that's also something that I don't think Graham Greene would have intended. It's just, anytime you set a book or film in Mexico and have, violence and high ideals and ethics be the kind of the matter that's being discussed, I think that you're naturally venturing into Western territory, whether you like it or not.
Is that bad for history or our connection to history? Do you feel like we're getting closer to understanding history through reading something like this? There is a lot of history in it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And ultimately, I don't know, because I don't have a standard to judge this book against. You know what I mean? Like, this is the only exposure I have to this idea that Catholic priests were being hunted down in the state of Tabasco. And, while I'm sure that there was a lot of poverty post-revolution, 1930s in Mexico, I have no idea the actual extent of that poverty. I have to imagine it was pretty bad, but honestly, some of the descriptions in this book reminded me of some of the post-apocalyptic novels that we've read. So, it's hard to look at these kinds of things through anything but our own references and our own lenses. What do you think? What do you think, Bob?
Well, I was watching a video. I think his name was Father Andrew. I should check that to make sure. I apologize if I got your name wrong, but he had a very interesting perspective, saying that a lot of the depictions of land here is due to Graham Greene's thinking, okay, Catholicism and God has been taken out of the land, so the land has become infertile, so nothing grows. There could be something, how authentic is that to what was really happening? Hard to say. But at the same time, the revolution was a lot about land. I mean, there was a uprising for peasants wanting more land, and a lot of the constitutional reforms came over land rights and disputes about land. So it's hard to say how much is the author trying to use theme and how much is the author trying to portray an authentic depiction of history. But yes, there are desperate scenes in this book, especially when he's just trying to fight a dog for a bone.
Oh my God.
That was so rough. Oh.
Yeah. The construction of this book was really interesting to me while reading it, because a lot of it, to my mind, was very slack. It lacked kind of propulsion to move us forward, and characters that could, drive it forward. So I was like, well, what was then the inspiration point for this book to be written? And I really struggled with that for about the first half. But then I think what I realized was it seemed to me like this book in Graham Greene's mind was a kind of mystic revelation of various scenes. A priest locked in a damp, dark prison cell with a bunch of other people. People are having sex in the background, and he's kind of, doing priestly activities there. He's ministering to people. Or a starving person fighting off a dog with a broken leg to get a bone. Or the body, being lured back to the body of the outlaw. I don't know. There were so many really, really powerful images in here. And I have to think that these are the images and the questions that are explored in those images. This is what is the inspiration point for this book.
Following the image. It reminded me a lot of Pinocchio. It makes me think of a picaresque, like you said, that it's unclear what what is pushing him forward. The goal is just to get back so he can confess. He's a priest himself, but he, having committed a mortal sin, he's got his goal. He's trying to get back home where he's originally a priest so he can confess to whoever might be still there. And that he's trying to do that, but he's going off on all of these roads either to survive or really, he could just get back. Like you said, he could have gotten back on that boat. That probably would have solved everything. But he's being distracted by mercy, or being distracted by grace, or being distracted by his duty as a priest. And I know that one of Graham Greene's intentions, he writes it at the end of Brighton Rock, which is the first in the Catholic series. But I guess it was the goal for the whole series. He says he wanted to explore the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God. And I think it's interesting to have this character who needs that mercy, and then also sees in many, many others who need that mercy. Even if it takes him off the path, getting off the path keeps him on the greater path, I guess.
It's interesting how both of the, I'll use air quotes here, historical fiction novels that we've read so far in this sequence really seem to be very hung up on choice. They're set in historical periods. Great events are happening, events of, world historical importance. But a lot of what these novels are focused on seems to be one insignificant person in this context, their own choices, their own behaviors that really don't actually have any kind of outcome that can affect anything on a global historical sense. You know what I mean? Him being a better priest, or being a worse priest even, would not have affected the outcome of how things shook out in post-revolution Mexico, in Tabasco, etc. Nor in Remains of the Day, Kazuo Ishiguro, would the butler challenging his master's Nazi sympathies, that also wouldn't have affected the slow progress towards World War II, for example. So in a global historical sense, these characters' choices are meaningless. And yet I think that what these books are asking us to do is consider how they are actually the most important questions. For our characters, at least, they're really all that matters.
And for us, we're all participating in history all the time, even if we're small actors in it. I think you're right. It's a big part of beliefs and decisions. We could say that Stevens in Remains of the Day is a martyr to his own belief and dignity. He misses out on a lot in life, but it's what he says, okay, this is what dignity is. I will prove myself to be a dignified person, and I will not stray from that path. And while the whiskey priest strays a lot, he never really does. He's just pulled and yanked and makes his own bad decisions, but he is always devoted to God.
We talk a lot about what are the meanings of all these different genres. What are the larger questions? And maybe if there's anything I want to explore with the historical fiction novel and see if this holds true is, does historical fiction ask us to think about our own place in history as people who are living through history and the choices we make? I don't know. Is this common to all, or is this just like maybe a fluke of the last few ones we've read? But things to consider. Things to consider.
It's going to be a wild ride through history, Zach.
Fire up the DeLorean, Bob. I'll talk to you later.
Talk to you later, Zach.